The sound came first, a dry, papery rattle that felt like it was inside your own teeth. It was the sound of a million tiny shears, of a living engine of hunger descending from a sky the color of brass. The grasshoppers arrived not as a swarm, but as a tide, a bristling, clicking, brown-green river that flowed over everything, leaving behind only the memory of green. Fields of corn that stood waist-high at dawn were stripped to rattling stalks by noon. Kitchen gardens, coaxed from the hard-pan soil with months of hauled water and aching backs, vanished in an hour. The town of promise huddled indoors, listening to the ceaseless, devouring rustle, and prayed. But Alara stood on her small porch, her hands still and resting on the worn rail, and watched them come. She watched the tide split and flow around her plot of land, as if it were a rock in a stream. The air above her rose shimmered with a different kind of motion, a frantic, feathered blur of gray and black and speckled brown. Her 46 ridiculous hens, the town's long-running joke, were earning their keep. 6 months earlier, the only thing Alara owned was a name on a deed to 3 acres of land everyone knew was worthless and a debt to Mr. Silas Croft at the mercantile that was heavy enough to bend a man's shoulders. Her husband, Tom, had left her with both before the fever took him, and the town of promise had offered its pity, which felt as thin and scratchy as a worn-out blanket. They expected her to fail. A woman alone, they said in murmurs she was meant to overhear, couldn't work a place like this. Especially not this place, with its pale, clay-heavy soil that baked to brick in the summer and turned to greasy mud in the spring. Silas Croft had been the most solicitous of all. "My deepest sympathies, Alara," he'd said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Don't you worry about the note. When the time is right, I'll take the land off your hands for a fair price. Help you get settled somewhere more suitable." He was giving her just enough rope, she knew, to hang herself with. Her inheritance was a patch of dirt and a ticking clock. And then there were the chickens. Tom had bought them in a fit of misguided optimism, a flock of 46 scrawny, long-legged birds called Cressley Grays. They were a local breed famous for being good at precisely nothing. They laid few eggs, their meat was stringy, and they were clever enough to be trouble. They were a walking punchline. Most sensible folk would have wrung their necks for a few meager pots of soup. But Alara watched them. She watched them for a week, her mind working through the arithmetic of survival. She had no money for good seed, no money for fertilizer, no money for a mule to break the hard pan. All she had was debt, worthless land, and 46 hungry, useless birds. She sat on her porch steps as dusk settled, the chickens scratching aimlessly in the dust, and a thought, quiet and mad, began to take root. It was a notion born of the fierce, stubborn practicality that poverty instills. The town saw 46 useless mouths to feed. Alara began to see 46 tireless workers who would work for nothing but pests and weeds. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the horizon, she opened the flimsy door to the coop and, with a stick, chivied the whole ragged flock out into the very vegetable patch she was supposed to protect from them. Her nearest neighbor, Mr. Gable, stopped his wagon in the road to stare. "Lost your mind, have you, Alara?" he called, his voice thick with a kind of pitying amusement. "Letting those scavengers pick the last bit of life out of that soil." Alara just lifted a hand in a quiet wave and kept watching her flock. The hens, confused for a moment by their sudden freedom, fanned out across the fallow vegetable rows. They began to scratch, and Alara began to work, her hands raw, her back screaming, turning their scratching into a plan. She worked with a methodical rhythm that became the new shape of her days. Before dawn, she was out with a bucket of water, a thing more precious than coin that she hauled from the dwindling creek at the far edge of her property. She didn't water the ground. She filled 3 wide, shallow clay dishes she'd made herself, placing them at the corners of the half-acre plot. The chickens learned the location of the water in a single day. Their world was now defined by the boundaries of the garden, a world of abundant water and, as they were discovering, abundant food. She watched them, learning their language. She saw how they scratched not randomly, but with a purpose digging deep for grubs and beetle larvae. She saw how they devoured the tough, stringy roots of the wiregrass that had choked the plot for years. They were tilling, deeper and more thoroughly than a spade. Their constant scratching and digging broke up the compacted clay, turning it over, aerating it. And with every grub they ate, with every weed they pulled, they left behind a tiny, potent speck of nitrogen-rich manure. They were not just tilling, they were fertilizing. Day after day, she guided them. She laid down lines of wood ash to keep them out of one section while they concentrated their efforts on another. She learned the soft cluck of contentment that meant they'd found a nest of wireworms, the sharp squawk of alarm that meant a hawk was circling. She was the shepherd of a feathered, scratching flock. The town kept watching. Their mockery was a constant, low hum at the edge of her hearing. Women passing on their way to the mercantile would shake their heads. Men would make jokes at the saloon about Alara's chicken farm. They saw a woman undone by grief, making a fool of herself on a fool's errand. They did not see the alchemy happening in the soil. They did not see the pale, dead clay slowly darkening to a rich, crumbly loam. They did not see the arithmetic she calculated in her head each night before sleep claimed her. 46 chickens, working 8 hours a day, turning over square foot by square foot of worthless land. It was a slow, painstaking reclamation. Old Man Hemlock was the only one who didn't mock her. He lived on the next plot over, a quiet, stooped man with eyes the color of a faded sky, who had come from some distant, unpronounceable country. He grew strange, lumpy vegetables in his own small garden and spoke to almost no one. For the first 2 weeks, he simply stood at his fence line each evening, watching her and her chickens. He never spoke, just watched, his hands resting on a gnarled walking stick. Alara felt his gaze, but it wasn't the pitying or scornful stare of the others. It was knowing. It was patient. She continued her work, hauling water, spreading ash, her hands cracking and her muscles burning with a clean, honest ache. She was too tired for despair. Despair was a luxury for people with time on their hands. All she had was the work, the sun, and the steady, scratching sound of her 46 feathered laborers. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the plains, Old Man Hemlock finally spoke. His voice was raspy, thick with an accent that smoothed the edges of his words. "They say you are mad," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Alara paused, leaning on her shovel, and looked at him. She didn't bother to deny it. They might be right. He nodded slowly, his gaze on the hens, who were now so accustomed to her presence they would peck gently at her worn boots. "In my country," he said, his eyes still on the birds, "we have a saying, the hungry thing is not the problem. It is the answer, if you point it the right way." Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it as hope. He understood. He saw not madness, but a method. From that day on, he offered small pieces of wisdom, dropped as casually as seeds. He told her to crush charcoal from her cook stove and mix it into the drinking water to keep the birds healthy. He showed her how to identify the deep green leaves of the plant and weed, which the chickens loved and which drew nutrients up from deep in the subsoil. He never offered to help with the labor. That, his bearing suggested, was hers alone, but his quiet validation was more valuable than a hired hand. Around that time, the boy appeared. His name was Finn, a scrawny 10-year-old with a shock of reddish hair and a smattering of freckles, who was always at the edges of things. He was drawn by the spectacle of the chickens. They were bigger than most Cressley Grays, their lean frames filling out on the diet of grubs and greens. They moved with a strange, confident dignity. Finn would sit on the rail fence for hours, just watching. One afternoon, he pointed to a large, handsome rooster with iridescent black-green tail feathers. "What's his name?" he asked. Alara, busy hauling a bucket of water, admitted she hadn't named any of them. "He looks like a general," Finn declared. General Fuzz. The name was so ridiculous that Alara laughed, a real, throat-clearing laugh that surprised them both. The name stuck. Soon, Finn had named them all. There was Beatrice, a stout hen who was always first to the water. There was Silas, named with a boy's innocent malice, a scrawny, nervous cockerel who was afraid of his own shadow. There was the Duchess, a speckled hen with a regal bearing. The flock ceased to be an anonymous collective and became a troop of 46 distinct personalities. Finn started helping, his small hands surprisingly deft at crushing charcoal or pulling the largest weeds to toss to the birds. He was company that asked for nothing. His presence, like hemlocks, became part of the rhythm of her days. By June, the soil was transformed. Where there had once been pale, cracked clay, there was now 6 inches of dark, rich, fragrant earth. It was time. Alara and Finn spent a day fencing off half the garden, moving the flock to the untouched section to begin their work anew. In the cultivated soil, Alara began a plant. She didn't have money for fancy seeds from the mercantile. She planted what she had, what she'd saved from the previous year, what she'd been given in a pitying charity basket after Tom's death. Beans, squash, potatoes, a few rows of tough leaf cabbage. She planted them in the dark, rich soil the chickens had prepared, and the earth seemed to welcome them. The first shoots that pushed through were not the pale, spindly things she was used to. They were thick-stemmed and a vibrant, confident green. They grew with an astonishing speed, fueled by the months of accumulated fertility. The town was still laughing, but the laughter had a brittle edge now. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. They saw the fence, the newly planted rows. Closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, Mr. Gable pronounced to anyone who would listen, "Those chickens have picked every last bit of good from that soil. Nothing will grow there now, but things were growing." Silas Croft paid her another visit. He rode up in his smart buggy, tying the horse to the fence and stepping carefully around the chicken droppings. He surveyed the flourishing green rows, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than condescension showed in his eyes. It looked like calculation. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a buttery purr. "A bit of luck, Alara. A small crop, after all. But this drought is settling in. It will be a hard summer. Perhaps it's time to be practical. I'll give you a fair price for the land and the crop as it stands. $70. Enough to clear your debt and see you on your way." $70 was an insult. It was less than the value of the debt itself. He was still expecting her to fail, just perhaps not as quickly as he'd hoped. He wanted her gone before those green shoots turned into something that might change the town's arithmetic. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even and calm. "But I think I'll see the harvest through." He smiled, a tight, unpleasant stretching of his lips. A woman's sentiment. "I understand. The offer stands for another month." After that, he let the threat hang in the air, then climbed back into his buggy and rode away. Alara watched him go, then turned back to her rows. The work was not done. The sun was hot, and the creek was low. The arithmetic was changing, but it had not yet tipped in her favor. She kept her success banked low, like a coal under ash, waiting for the right moment to let it breathe. The rows of beans climbed their poles, the squash vines sent out exploratory tendrils, and under the wide, waxy leaves, the cabbages began to form tight, heavy heads. The chickens, on their side of the fence, continued their slow, steady work of tillage and pest control, a living, feathered barrier against the coming hardship. The first person to taste the proof was a man named Abe, the perpetually flustered cook from the stagecoach inn. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, and the heat and the lack of rain had withered every kitchen garden and promise. Abe's suppliers had nothing for him. His patrons, dusty and irritable from their long journeys, were complaining about the endless salt pork and mealy potatoes. He came to Alara's gate as a last resort, his face grim with the expectation of failure. "Mrs. Gable said you had some greens growing," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it for a second. "I know it's a long shot." Alara didn't speak. She took the basket from his hand, walked to the row of cabbages, and with a sharp knife, cut a head the size of a small cannonball. It was dense and heavy, the outer leaves a deep, glossy green, the inner heart a pale, creamy white. She added a dozen yellow summer squash, their skins smooth and unblemished, and a double handful of beans so crisp they snapped when she touched them. She placed the basket back in his hands. Abe stared. He had not seen vegetables like this since he'd left the green river valleys of the east. He lifted a bean to his mouth and bit into it. A look of profound astonishment crossed his face. It tasted of greenness, of summer, of rich soil and clean water. It was the taste of something real. "My God," he whispered. "Ow!" Alara simply nodded toward the other side of the fence, where the flock of Cressley Grays was busy scratching and pecking in the dust. General Fuzz let out a crow that sounded less like a rooster and more like a rusty gate hinge. Eb just shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What do I owe you?" he asked. She named a price that was fair, not cheap, but far from a gouging she could have managed. It was the first real money she had earned from the land. Abe paid it without a word, his eyes full of a newfound respect. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. And the day after that, he became her first customer, and his loyalty was fierce. The passengers on the stagecoach began to talk about the miraculous vegetables at the inn in Promise, about the crisp beans and the sweet, tender squash. Word traveled. A few townswomen, driven by curiosity and the dismal state of their own gardens, came to her gate, their purses held tight. They left with baskets of produce and confused expressions. The quality was undeniable. The price was fair. It didn't align with the story they had all agreed upon, the story of the grieving widow who had lost her mind. It was much harder to mock a woman whose cabbages were twice the size of your own. The money went into a small wooden box she kept under a loose floorboard. She counted it every night. The arithmetic was finally starting to look like hope. The sky stayed a hard, merciless blue. The sun baked the world, and the creek shrank until it was just a series of stagnant pools connected by a muddy trickle. The dust from the road coated everything in a fine, gritty powder. In the other gardens around Promise, the plants gave up, leaves yellowed and curled, the earth around their roots cracking open like parched lips. But Alara's garden remained a patch of defiant green. The soil, so full of organic matter from the chickens' work, acted like a sponge, holding onto the precious moisture from her nightly trips to the creek. The thick layer of mulch she'd created from spoiled hay protected it from the worst of the sun's glare. The town's silence was now a palpable thing. The jokes had stopped. Instead, there were long, measuring stares as people passed her property. They looked at her green rows, then at their own withered ones, and the envy was a sour taste in the air. Old Man Hemlock squinted at the horizon. "Too quiet," he said one evening, his voice low. "No birds singing in the afternoon. The air is waiting." He pointed with his chin at a fat, brown-winged grasshopper clinging to a fence post. "This one is a scout. The army is coming." Alara had seen them, too. A few at first, then a dozen, then 100. They were larger than usual, bolder. She had watched her chickens with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. But the hen saw the grasshoppers not as a threat, but as a feast. They would stalk them with a predator's focus, their heads cocked, and then snatch them from the air with a quick, vicious peck. For now, they were keeping the numbers down. But she could feel it, just as Hemlock could. The land was holding its breath. The crisis was no longer a matter of if, but when. Silas Croft's deadline was approaching. The note was due at the end of August. He hadn't been back, but she knew he was watching, waiting. He was a patient man. He had seen droughts before. He knew that a patch of green could turn to a patch of brown overnight. He was counting on it. She counted, too. In the quiet of her small cabin, by the light of a single candle, she would empty the wooden box and count the coins and bills. The arithmetic of hope versus the arithmetic of debt. It was going to be close. She worked harder, hauling more water in the pre-dawn cool, carefully harvesting only what was ready, letting nothing go to waste. She and Finn devised a system, a scarecrow made of shiny tin lids that spun in the breeze, meant to deter the hawks that had grown bolder as their usual prey disappeared. Her flock was too valuable to lose a single one. The hens grew fat and sleek. Their eggs, which had been few and small, were now plentiful, with deep orange yolks from their rich diet. She began selling them to Abe as well, another small stream of income into the box. Each coin was a victory. Each dollar was a brick in the wall she was building against the coming storm. The air grew thick and still. The silence of the afternoons became profound. And then, on the third Monday of August, the waiting ended. The sound began at dawn, a low, pervasive hum that grew steadily, resolving itself into that dry, clicking rattle. Alara stepped onto her porch and saw it. The northern horizon was gone, replaced by a low, roiling cloud of dirty brown. It wasn't weather. It was life. It was hunger. The plague of grasshoppers descended upon the valley. The town of promise vanished under the tide. People ran for their homes, slamming doors and shuttering windows, but there was no stopping it. The insects covered everything, a single, crawling, chewing entity. The sound was deafening, a nightmare of a million tiny mandibles shearing away every living leaf. The few withered crops that had survived the drought were obliterated in minutes. Trees were stripped bare, their leaves vanishing as if consumed by a fast-moving fire. It was a biblical devastation, swift and absolute. But at Alara's fence line, a miracle was happening. The tide of insects, drawn to the only vibrant green for miles, crashed against her property, and her army met them. The 46 Cressley Greys, who had been lazily dusting themselves near the coop, erupted into a state of manic, joyful fury. They had been feasting on grasshoppers for weeks, but this was a banquet beyond their wildest dreams. They did not panic, they attacked. They fanned out across the rows, a whirling, feathered ballet of destruction. They leaped into the air, snatching insects from flight. They ran with a surprising speed, their heads darting left and right, gobbling, swallowing, and turning for more. General Fuzz stood on a fence post, his head held high, letting out triumphant, rusty crows as he surveyed his troops. Finn, who had run over at the first sign of the swarm, stood beside Alara on the porch, his mouth wide open in awe. The garden became a battleground. The grasshoppers that managed to land on a cabbage leaf were devoured before they could take a second bite. The air was thick with the clicking of the swarm and the frantic, happy clucking of the hens. For hours, the battle raged. The hens, driven by a bottomless gluttony, never tired. They were engines of pest control, perfected for this exact moment. By late afternoon, the main body of the swarm had passed, moving south, leaving a brown, barren landscape in its wake. The world outside Alara's fence was silent and ruined. But inside, the garden stood. It was battered, with a few chewed leaves here and there, but it was overwhelmingly, impossibly green. The hens, stuffed to bursting, were calming down, moving with the slow, waddling gait of the truly satiated. They had defended the fortress. Alara looked out at the stripped fields of her neighbors, at the skeletal remains of their hopes, and then back at her own verdant, thriving plot. The arithmetic had changed forever. It was no longer about her survival. It was about the town's. The hunger set in quickly. The swarm had eaten everything, not just the crops in the fields, but the small kitchen gardens that provided the margin between sustenance and starvation for most families. The shelves at Silas Croft's mercantile, already low because of the drought, began to empty. What little he had, he sold at prices that climbed higher each day. A day after the swarm, Mr. Gable appeared at Alara's gate. He was the one who had laughed the loudest, who had been the most certain of her failure. Now he stood with his hat in his hands, his face gray with worry, his eyes avoiding hers. "Alara," he began, his voice rough. "My wife, the children, we have nothing green. I was wondering if I might buy a cabbage." It was the moment she had unknowingly been working toward. The moment of her vindication. A sharp, hot sense of triumph flared in her chest, and with it, the temptation to turn the knife. She could charge him double, triple what the produce was worth. She could make him beg. She could recite his own mocking words back to him. She looked at his slumped shoulders, at the desperation etched around his eyes, and the fire of her anger cooled into something else. She thought of Old Man Hemlock's quiet wisdom, of Finn's uncomplicated belief in her. She thought of what it felt like to be hungry and afraid. Being right was its own kind of reply. "Of course, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice gentle. She went and cut him the largest cabbage in the patch and pulled a handful of beans. When she told him the price, it was the same fair price she had charged Abe the cook. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, painful shame. He fumbled in his pocket for the coins, his hand trembling slightly as he passed them to her. "Thank you, Elara," he mumbled, not looking at her. "God bless you." He left, carrying the vegetables like they were precious jewels. He must have told others. Within the hour, another neighbor came, and then two more. By evening, a quiet, orderly line had formed at her gate. They were her mockers, her doubters, the chorus of scorn that had followed her for months. Now they came to her for food, their faces a mixture of desperation and humility. She treated each one with the same quiet dignity. She harvested what they needed, charged them all the same fair price, and sent them home with something to put on their family's table. She was not just selling food. She was selling grace, and it was a currency the town of Promise was in desperate need of. The wooden box under the floorboards grew heavy. The weight of it was more than just coin. It was security. It was independence. It was the final, irrefutable answer to the town's long argument. She had not only survived, she had thrived, and she had done it by seeing value where they had seen only waste. On the last day of August, the day the note was due, Silas Croft arrived. He was not alone. He had the town constable with him, a portly man who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task. Croft had clearly come to make a public spectacle of the foreclosure. He must have assumed the grasshopper plague had finished what the drought had started. His expression was one of solemn, predatory regret. He dismounted from his buggy and strode to the gate, the foreclosure papers held prominently in his hand. "Elara," he said, his voice loud enough for the small crowd of onlookers. Neighbors who had come not to gawk but to buy vegetables, to hear clearly. "It brings me no pleasure to do this. I gave you every chance, but a debt is a debt. The land is now forfeit." He made to unlatch the gate, to stride in and claim his prize. And then he stopped. For the first time, he truly saw it. He saw the lush, untouched rows of beans and squash. He saw the massive heads of cabbage. He saw the line of townspeople holding baskets, waiting patiently. He saw the green, an obscene, impossible green in a world of brown. His face, for a moment, was a mask of pure, slack-jawed shock. But Silas Croft was not a man easily defeated. He recovered in an instant, his mind spinning, calculating the new reality. His eyes narrowed. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice shifting back to its smooth, oily purr. "A miracle. A true miracle." He turned to the crowd. "But this is too much for one person to handle. All this produce, it could spoil before she can sell it all. As the new owner of this land, and as a civic duty, I will purchase the entire crop from her. For a generous price, of course. $100 for everything. I will see to it that it is distributed fairly." The trap was obvious. He would buy it all for a pittance and then sell it back to the desperate townspeople at his own inflated prices. He would turn her triumph into his profit. The crowd murmured, sensing the injustice. Elara met his gaze. Her heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. She was no longer the frightened widow he had tried to intimidate. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "The land is not yours." From the pocket of her apron, she withdrew a small cloth sack. She walked to the gate, unlatched it, and stood before him. She looked him directly in the eye and, without another word, began to count. She counted out the full and final payment of her husband's debt, coin by coin, bill by bill, into the constable's hand. The sound of the money, the clink of silver and the rustle of paper, was the only sound in the yard. When she was finished, the exact amount lay in the constable's palm. She had paid it off, with 3 days to spare. Silas Croft's face was a study in fury. He had been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and publicly shamed. He snatched the money from the constable, stuffed it into his pocket, and stormed back to his buggy without a backward glance. The crowd watched him go, and then they turned to Elara, and for the first time, they smiled. The departure of Silas Croft left a space in the air, a vacuum that was quickly filled by a sense of quiet celebration. The townspeople did not cheer, but a collective sigh of relief and admiration went through them. The transaction was complete. The underdog had won. The story was now rewritten. Alara was no longer the mad widow. She was the wise woman, the one who had seen what no one else could. She continued selling her produce, her gate open from sunup to sundown. She established a system of barter for those who had no cash, trading a basket of squash for a mended shirt, a dozen eggs for a sharpening of her shovel blade. She was weaving herself back into the fabric of the community, not as an object of pity, but as a vital, load-bearing thread. The land, once scorned, was now the town's larder. The chickens, once a joke, were now hailed as heroes. Finn became their unofficial keeper, a boy bursting with pride, who would regale customers with tales of General Fuzz's bravery during the Great Grasshopper War. As the heat of August finally broke and the first hints of autumn cooled the evenings, Alara stood with Old Man Hemlock and Finn, looking out over her domain. The rows were thinner now, but still productive. The hens, fat and content, were making their final rounds before heading to the coop to roost. The setting sun cast long shadows, turning the rich soil a deep, promising black. Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling as deep and nourishing as the soil itself. She owned this land not just on paper, but in her bones. She had paid for it not just with coins, but with sweat, with stubbornness, and with the courage to believe in a ridiculous idea. Old Man Hemlock leaned on his fence post, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He watched a fat hen peck at a beetle, then looked at Alara, his faded blue eyes seeming to see the whole long story in a single glance. "You see," he said, his voice the soft rumble of gravel. "The hungry thing. You pointed it the right way." Alara nodded, a slow smile spreading across her own face. She looked at her flock, at the ridiculous, long-legged, noble birds who had tilled and fertilized and fought for her. They were the answer. They had always been the answer. The whole world had looked at them and seen nothing but a problem, but she had looked closer and had seen the shape of her own salvation. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the coming of a gentler season. A new kind of arithmetic was taking shape in her mind, one not of debt and survival, but of surplus and seasons, of planting for the next year on land that was truly, finally, hers.